Hello all together, and thank you for tuning in with Cytomedical this week. This week I have a very, very special guest, Donald Birnie. Donald Birnie is someone who I met almost more than 2 years, almost 3 years ago. And Donald Birnie is, ever since then, always a go-to address for me. He is a very experienced engineer in the medical device industry, and I'm very lucky to have him today on the channel to interview him about the evolution of MedTechs in our industry. So looking forward, Donald, how are you today?
Well, hi, Simon, and thanks for the glowing introduction. As I say, I'm tickety-boo today. Yeah, looking forward to the chat, wherever that takes us.
Exactly. This is Donald, how I know him. And I want to explain how I first met you. So Donald was in an interview, or rather in a discussion with a client already in a meeting room on site. And I was introduced to Donald via a Teams meeting. And Donald was one of the persons that struck me as very knowledgeable, because he knew about 820.25 and the training requirements regarding validation. And this was the meeting where I knew, okay, this person definitely knows his stuff. And it turned out to be very true. Whenever I have questions, and I have a lot of questions, I get to trade knowledge for Chinese meals. This is how we deal.
That's our currency, indeed.
Let's get into it. So the idea behind this interview is that, you have been in the industry for many, many years, and therefore you already know the entire history and why we are where we are. Interesting and also very helpful for younger people, or basically for everyone, to understand where regulations are coming from. So can you describe the early days of the regulatory landscape in our industry?
So I think back to my more than 2 decades now in the industry, and the quality management system standards that we adhered to, or at least some of us attempted to adhere to back in the day. I go back to the time of the application of BS 5750 Parts 1 and Parts 2, where ISO 9001 was being created for industry. And this was seen as an opportunity for the medical device and the life sciences generally to have a formalized standard for quality management systems that would help them comply with the 2 core deliverables, meeting the requirements of the, at the time, in vitro diagnostics directive, the medical device directive, and active implantables. So they were European directives. And we had in 1997 the arrival of Part 820, the Quality System Regulation, as it was formerly known, which had superseded the GMP, the Good Manufacturing Practice Regulation. That time period in the late 90s marked probably the first major step change for us in the industry, because the FDA introduced formal deliverables for design control. So up until then, under the GMP, there was really no mention or inference to the requirements of design. What had been established through experience and events was that design, the design of the device, the design and development of the processes to make the device, were fundamental in ensuring that we had safe and effective devices on the market, because the previous manufacturing-focused regulation and standard really ensured that operations teams made repeatable, continuous output of whatever. So if it was a poor standard of design, they would make that poor standard of design incredibly efficiently and very repeatably. So the threat to the population, as was identified by the FDA, who incidentally are still the organization that the agency doffs its cap to, they are the serious end of the regulatory spectrum. They determined that far too many people were being hurt, some seriously, and some deaths were occurring, not because of manufacturing practices, but because of design and fundamental flaws in design. That's where we first experienced and engaged in interesting discussions around design requirements and making a good design manufacturable in quantity, in volume, so that it was economically viable. So at that time, the expectation was that design teams would no longer be able to throw over the wall a design and say to manufacturing, hey, go ahead and make it. So that was the big step change. Obviously, ISO 9001 went through a number of iterations and steadily transitioned away from the rigor that was necessary to meet the requirements of regulation. We went through a number of iterations of ISO 9001, and we had the EN 46000 series appended to it for design. But it came to the point where the baker, the butcher, the candlestick maker could all have ISO 9001 certificates on the wall, and it was largely now a marketing exercise. So the International Standards Organization felt compelled to create what we now know today as ISO 13485. And it now has gone through a number of iterations as expectations and ongoing requirements have changed. And we've increasingly evolved in the industry to embrace new technologies, but also to forge new paths in creating new technologies. So the landscape changed. But we also, and we'll perhaps cover it later in the discussion, but we also had a number of events that caused the European community to have thoughts about whether or not 1345 was entirely suitable, or indeed was the device directive as it stood at the time entirely suitable. Was it keeping a pace with the needs of the industry and the challenges that industry were presenting? That forced the European Commission to say, okay, the medical device directive is adopted into law by each member state by way of a statutory instrument. So the government would vote to bring it into local legislation. That created inconsistencies in its interpretation and application. So the European Commission, in true Brussels style, decided we'll take control. And they created the behemoth that became the EU MDR and the IVDR. Wow. For those of us who've been through that transition, it has left scars. That was an exercise in unnecessarily overcomplicating things while at the same time failing to address what they originally set out to achieve. The biggest change in the application of the regulation as opposed to the directive was not that we had uniformity in expectation, but it placed a considerable burden on notified bodies and competent authorities. When you think about it, all this time, for those of us who were either manufacturing devices in the US for the US market, or out in the bigger wide world were creating devices for the US market, we'd already had to comply with the QSR, 21 CFR Part 820. And for those of us with US Class 2 and Class 3 devices, most of us had experienced an FDA inspection. An FDA inspection bears absolutely no resemblance to a notified body audit. And it was expected that the introduction of the European regulation would change that landscape and change it for the better, because it's a commercial relationship. And many notified bodies don't want to upset their client by telling them too many bad things. And we had a proliferation of notified bodies in the MDD days. That changed, and there was substantial panic throughout Europe when we transitioned to the MDR, and a number of notified bodies fell by the way. They were unable to meet the requirements for assessment to the new MDR and IVDR. Sadly, however, though, the performance of notified bodies continues to be a bugbear for manufacturers. They believe they're doing really well. They continue to get and experience great audits with their notified body. We might have a minor non-conformance, but more often than not, they're observations. So no big deal, and they'll review them when they come back in a year's time to do the next cyclical audit. Then along comes Mr. or Mrs. Inspector from the agency, and they literally blow it all up. Now, in my time when I lived and worked in the US, our facility had Class 3 devices, so we were assured of at least an annual inspection. And for me, that inspection was a testament to the standard of our ethics and morality, as well as our proficiency in making good, safe, effective devices. So my job was to ensure that compliance with the requirement was intuitive. We had to do nothing extra or out of the ordinary, because being compliant actually made good sense. Not only that, but it actually drove efficiency. If you want to validate a manufacturing process to a good standard, and when we say good, we're perhaps talking about a CPK of 1.3, that's a good, robust process. Therefore, we've minimal wastage. We have little opportunity of need to rework anything. So we're not generating scrap. We're not generating costly, wasted devices in process. And we've reliable, steady output, which is good for the business, but it's especially good for the customer, because that customer, typically the doctor or the healthcare professional, opens the packet. They're the next quality inspector, and they get a product that works exactly as they expect and intend it to. So the gulf continues to exist between notified body audits and FDA inspections. And that I find a little alarming. You and I both know from our consultancy work that a lot of the work originates as a consequence of an organization having experienced an agency inspection. And they're going, what just happened? We've been producing this product for 10 years. We've had annual audits from a notified body. Nothing's gone wrong. Everything's been fine. Yeah, we get complaints, but they're just complaints. And then suddenly this inspector shows up and pulls the rug. What happened? That's been the experience of many a manufacturer outside the US, for sure. And for those who want to do a dot the I, cross the T to satisfy the subsequent 483 observation or whatever, that's an exercise in futility, because they will come back and they expect to find you having advanced, progressed. So this has been the norm for the last number of years until February of this year. And the agency, as anticipated, decided for a number of reasons to update 820 and bring it into alignment, but not fully adopt the requirements as they're defined in 1345. This is a seismic shift, because in between all of that, we had the introduction of MDSAP, the Medical Device Single Audit Program. So those organizations who didn't particularly want or were keen on having an FDA inspection rapidly signed up to MDSAP to do their best to avoid that inspection experience. And for lower risk devices, that works. That was fine. However, for those in the high risk 2s and the class 3s, there is no getting away from the FDA inspection. Of course, FDA has limited resource. So they make sure that they get bang for their buck when they send an inspector outside the US. So they don't want a fledgling inspector. They want to send their best, most accomplished inspector who can achieve a lot, cover a lot of ground in a business in a short period of time, because keep in mind that inspector has a plane ticket to arrive and one to leave. It's not like the US, where I would have an inspection last perhaps 3 weeks. We've got these inspectors now, very, very knowledgeable and experienced. They will have an expertise on a given aspect of the regulation, typically microbiology or process, but ultimately they will cover it intensely. And the new quality management system regulation, which has adopted so much of 1345, also retains much of the old QSR, because 1345 just doesn't do it for the FDA. However, and this is where I've been particularly impressed with your organization, Simon, and the talent that exists to support clients in this particular area, and that is the area of risk management. We as an industry bandy about the term, we take a risk-based approach. Do you honestly, truly understand what that means when you say it? Because time and time again, I come across people who genuinely don't, but it does sound good, you have to admit.
Yeah, absolutely.
So risk management is really front and center of the new quality management system regulation. In the old QSR, risk management was largely refined to one specific area of design. Now it's everything, throughout the entire life cycle of the device. So from womb to tomb, that device has risk management and the various risk management techniques applied. But it's not just the design and the manufacturing processes of the device. It's the supporting services of the device that are subject to risk management, in particular systems. So when we're looking at our dreaded CAPA, that's subject to risk management. How do we grade our CAPA activities? How do we determine the severity and the potential harm that could be caused by an excursion from a specification? Complaint analysis is a huge area for risk management and the application of those tools. How are we evaluating? How are we in the 1345 world constantly monitoring and measuring the effectiveness of our systems, not just processes?
Mm-hmm.
So the FDA have seen this as a gift, an opportunity to bring risk management fully into the quality management system regulation. So a word of caution or a word of advice, some friendly advice to those manufacturers out there watching or listening to this, you really do need to have your ducks in a row as regards risk management, because it will be your undoing. Risk management does not equal an FMEA. Risk management is comprehensive and it touches everything. But just as we experienced way back in 1997 and since, when you embrace it and you apply it in a structured, competent fashion, it actually supports the business. You're generating less defects. You're analyzing your data that comes back to help you with your post-market clinical follow-up activities. You're determining what is good and not so good for the patient, and what can you follow up in the next generation of product to make it better. That gives you a competitive edge in the marketplace, an increasingly volatile marketplace. So there is much to recognize in the change that we've seen in the regulation, but there is so much to embrace, because actually it makes good business sense. The FDA have seen, because they are one of the original founders of the MDSAP program, as part of the whole global harmonization initiative to make regulatory standards on a worldwide basis more harmonized. So we're in an evolving place, but that's good, because it's making for better devices, harming fewer people, and it's helping bring newer technologies to market that ultimately help people get better.
Donald, before we get into that, I have a couple of questions, because you gave a very good picture already, but you said it was prior to the 90s, before design control emerged. It was GMP only. So what was the major difference to GMP as we know it today? So what did it look like 30 years ago?
Yeah, GMP was ostensibly good manufacturing practice. In a nutshell, that was it. So the whole front end, the design and development piece, was non-existent from a regulatory perspective. And that suited quite a number of people, because they were free from the glare of an inspector. It also didn't do too much once you delivered that product to market. So the post-market aspect wasn't particularly robust. And if we look at what prompted the evolution of those requirements, they all stem back to the industry hurting people. The industry has not been trusted to do the right thing. And that sadly continues to be the case. Now, I compartmentalize that into two fields. There are those organizations who strive tirelessly to do the right thing, but they just struggle to do the right thing, either through a lack of knowledge, expertise, access to the appropriate resources. Not just people. When we say resources, we mean tools, systems, etc. And then there are those others who don't give a damn. And for them, it's about being in a market sector that commands a high premium for a product. Because let's be honest, if you do it well, medical device world, life sciences is a hugely profitable market segment. If you do it not so well, you can still make a great deal of money. So with poor regulation and poor enforcement of the regulation, we have encouraged some less than scrupulous organizations to exist. And that has resulted in harm to people. Sometimes knowingly, often unknowingly. So the regulation and our post-market clinical follow-up requirements, our post-market surveillance activities, those elements are forcing the industry to go back and take a long, hard look at itself and say, is this okay? Coming back to risk, is our benefit risk assessment holding up to scrutiny. What is the use, the real use experience relating to the actual and what we intended? Because when you think about it, without having design control as part of a regulatory landscape, there was little to concern themselves about the effectiveness of the product. Just did it do something? And now it's a closed loop. We start off with requirements, and design requirements, for those that aren't familiar, do include regulatory requirements. They are design inputs. I have to admit and give Brussels some credit. When you look at Annex 1 of the EU MDR, that extensive list is all design inputs. And for Annex 1, you have to consider them all, each and every one. And where you decide one is not applicable, you have to provide a documented rationale why it's not applicable. But if you think about it, those several hundred elements of Annex 1 of the EU MDR are design inputs. So you better have that up front in your design input phase as deliverables. And that's ultimately what will drive the creation and subsequent production of and making available to market a good medical device.
Thanks, Donald. You also quickly talked about the difference between an FDA inspector and a notified body auditor. So how can we raise awareness? Because sometimes I feel like if you have never gone through an FDA inspection, you just don't believe the story until you are part of the story. So what do you think, what can be done in order to raise awareness and make it more accessible to people who haven't had the experience yet?
For anyone who's never experienced an FDA inspection, and it is an inspection, not an audit, it's an altogether different experience from the beginning right through to the conclusion. So what you need to bear in mind is that your friendly, agreeable, notified body auditor, who is probably the same person your organization has had for years, and that familiarity is a problem because you can become very good friends on a professional level. Your auditor from your notified body presumes that you comply with what you attest to comply with, and he's looking to confirm your compliance with those requirements. And if you don't comply, he'll write you an observation. Only in the most catastrophic of circumstances does your notified body threaten to withdraw or suspend your certification. Because in order to do that, a calamity has happened. So we're fine. We keep on ticking over. We expect to get the odd observation or minor non-conformance. It's not a major inconvenience. What could possibly go wrong? Then the FDA shows up. Well, their mission is entirely different. Their mission, as stated on their website, is to protect the population of the US from scurrilous, incompetent, untrustworthy, unreliable medical device manufacturers, because that's what they assume we are, until we prove otherwise. So when an FDA inspector shows up, and if it's in a US territory, they'll come with a badge, and many of them, as I've experienced, are packing a pistol, because in the US, people get upset and they can shoot at them. So they have to be in a position to defend themselves. So when you have someone walking to your plant who's packing a holster and producing a federal agent badge, that immediately changes the volume and the stress level. That's number one. Number two, you are served a document at the beginning of that inspection, which you will sign, which attests that everything that you will produce during that inspection is the provision of evidence. And it's evidence that may result in prosecution. Prosecution. We're not talking, an observation or a minor nonconformance. We're talking prosecution. So suddenly, things are in a different tone altogether. The FDA assume you are guilty until you can produce the evidence and the documentation that you're innocent. Notified body, you're innocent until they prove you guilty. Complete flip of the coin with the FDA. And it's this collection of evidence, which, if it's disagreeable, they will write you a 483. Now, 483 gets its name from the form template that they write on. It's a Form 483. So if someone says, oh, we got 7 483s, no, you didn't. You got one 483 document with 7 observations on it. They are observations of objectionable instances. Those 483s command a response from your organization, a comprehensive response to answer each observation. The 483 and your responses will be reviewed by a team in the district office. It is they who will determine the escalation if escalation is necessary. It's called Enforcement Action Indicated, or EAI. You do not want your response from a 483 going through that escalation mechanism, because the next thing that arrives, courtesy of UPS or FedEx, is this thing called a warning letter. That's a bad place to be. Your name, your business, and the product is up in lights on the agency website, and your competitor gets to see it. Your competitor gets to know where your weak points are and how bad you've been. And they waste no opportunity to go to their client, a hospital group, a healthcare agency, whichever, with the purchasing power, and leave your organization without a name because you've been so bad, you got a warning letter. In my very early stages of the career, I worked for one of the world's largest medical device manufacturers in the world. So you expect them to be really pretty squeaky clean and tip-top. Well, out in California, where our franchise head office was located, we had been less than squeaky clean. Management at the site had decided they weren't going to necessarily comply with the rigor and the timeliness to intervene in what some employees expressed as a concerning situation. So frustrated were those 2 employees that they decided to go directly to the FDA and blow the whistle. So the FDA said, well, we hear your concern and that's great, but we can only work with evidence. So tell you what, here's what we're going to do. We're going to ask you to set up a meeting with your management team to discuss this very topic. And we're going to mic you, and we'll sit in a van outside the campus and record the meeting. And that meeting recording will serve as evidence. Are you okay with that? Well, in the US, there's significant financial reward for whistleblowers. So you have to appreciate that different from Europe and other parts of the world, people are penalized for whistleblowing, not rewarded. The US is a little different. So they had the meeting, the US in their little van, recorded the meeting and took the record of that meeting to the court and obtained a warrant from the court. The following Monday, they showed up at the campus with a fleet of Ryder trucks, a swarm of federal marshals, surrounded the campus with crime scene tape, jacked up filing cabinets, desks with computers, and loaded the trucks. Commanding, guys with pistols, remember, commanding employees to stand up and step away from their desk. Some employees were so traumatized they never returned to work. The agency didn't find what they were looking for, specifically. But with everything they had and the access to it, they found other things. Those other things were sufficient that they served a notice of intended prosecution to the business. And the business went to court and entered a plea bargain with the state, with the federal government, and they were bound over by terms of special probation, otherwise known as a consent decree. So we've gone straight, no 483, no nothing. We've gone straight from recording an interview or a meeting to obtaining a warrant to obtain documentation and gather evidence for intended prosecution to, okay, you've got us bound to rights. We're going to be bound over now. And as a result, they had Quintiles consultants, as recommended by the FDA, to sit in their facility and literally be involved in batch release of the product. You are not going to find a notified body engaging to that extent. It's a different world entirely. You do not want that level of hurt falling upon your business. But every month without fail, we see on the FDA's website, organizations continuing to receive warning letters. And every single time that warning letter was entirely avoidable.
You also talked about the commercial relationship that we have with our notified body. How does this affect? Is this advantageous or maybe not so advantageous for manufacturers and ultimately the people?
On a personal level, I don't like it. I don't like a commercial relationship coming between the generator of the wealth and the consumer of the product when it's something that impacts whether or not someone lives or dies. A fully proper independent assessment body is really what's necessary. FDA charges you to register your facility, your business with them, and that's it. They don't care what that situation is. Whereas the notified body, they're a commercial entity and they have to run profitably. And as I said previously, they really don't want to upset people. But if there's a notified body that I implicitly trust within Europe, it is TÜV-SÜD. The integrity of the personnel that they have, the rigor of the training that they provide, and I don't know if poach is the correct word, but they recruit from industry some of the brightest and best talent. And their mission is to ensure that anything that has a TÜV CE mark is worthy of that mark. Sadly, TÜV-SÜD are in a rather small minority.
Talking about prosecution, there were a couple of events that changed the regulatory landscape entirely.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, so I suppose this is a little chronology of things, if you will, because something I remind people of, changes to regulation are never proactive. Never proactive. They're reactive. They wait for the industry to prove itself bad and then slap some restrictions on us. And that's generally not good for the business from a creativity and flow perspective. More regulation is not necessarily good. But if we can't be trusted to do the right thing, then yeah, we're going to get regulated. It's as simple as that. So if we go all the way back to, say, 1937, an organization called S&E Messingill & Co. in the US created a product called Sulfanilamide. Now, sulfanilamide was a drug that was produced previously in powder or tablet form to treat strep throat, streptococcal infection of the throat. And this is something that's very, very common in kids. Kids get throat infection, strep throat, and they need some medicine to cure it. If anyone has a small child, you will know how difficult it is to get a small child to take a tablet when you want them to. They'll probably have no difficulty in taking a tablet the size of a sweet when you really rather they didn't take it. But when you want them to take medicine to make them better, they don't want to know a tablet at all. The chief chemist of S&E Messingill was charged with the task of making liquid suspension fluid for the drug. And to sweeten it, because kids will have absolutely no problem at all in consuming a sweet syrup. Unfortunately, because there was no obligation whatsoever to test for the safety of these materials, the suspension fluid contained diethylene glycol. Now, people may be unfamiliar with what diethylene glycol is, but you typically find it in antifreeze or cheap Bulgarian wine. It's not good for you. It's toxic. So, as you can imagine, this was put in the market. No testing was required for pharmaceutical drugs in relation to that. And it was released to public. 107 people, pretty much all children, but 107 people died from taking that medicine. That caused uproar. If there is something that can be guaranteed to cause uproar with parliamentarians in particular, it's children dying needlessly. So that prompted Congress to pass the Food, Drug and Cosmetic Act in 1938. And we think to current day, Part 820 is a subset of the Food, Drug and Cosmetic Act, commonly referred to as just the Act in the industry. We started to get regulated because industry killed people. You might think that that would cause industry to pause for thought, think long and hard about what they were doing, and get smart. Not a bit. During World War II, a Canadian-American, a phenomenal lady, Dr. Frances Alton Kelsey, she had done some studies in relation to the drug quinine. And we know quinine as one of two things. It's either an anti-malarial drug or it's a key ingredient in tonic water that we have with our gin and tonic. That gin and tonic was a drink in parts of the world for colonialists to prevent contracting malaria. So she wanted to know what the risks associated with the consumption and absorption of quinine was, in particular to the unborn. So she did studies to determine whether or not quinine as a drug could cross the placental barrier to the unborn. So she did a huge raft of testing and studies on rabbits. And she determined that yes, scientifically, the drug was capable of passing from the mother to the unborn kitten. Therefore, if you applied that logic to pharmaceuticals and humans, we really need to start understanding what the potential effects on the unborn are if pregnant women consume a drug. Now, simultaneously, at this time, a pharmaceutical company in Germany had created a drug that we've come to know as thalidomide. And this introduced us to the first recognizable events, I suppose, of what's called off-label use. Thalidomide was created by the pharmaceutical company to aid sleep. A number of pregnant women were showing up at their doctor's surgery, suffering from lack of sleep through pregnancy, especially in the latter trimesters of pregnancy, where sleep becomes a challenge. And the doctors started prescribing them thalidomide. The next big market opportunity for the pharmaceutical company was the United States. So their new drug application landed on the desk of none other than Frances Kelsey. And she started asking questions. Where's your data to support safety? Based on my experience, based on the chemistry, what have you got to show me that this drug is not going to harm the unborn? As that debate is being had, and Frances Kelsey was under huge pressure from the lobby groups in the US because this drug was a license to print money. Women were giving birth to deformed children in Europe. That was, I suppose, in close to our lifetime, maybe mine more so than yours, the first instance of a regulator saying, whoa, time out. The evidence does not exist to support this submission. And in fact, evidence from elsewhere would indicate that this is harmful. You can't prove the safety and efficacy of this product. So recognizing what she'd done, there's a wonderful photograph out there of Dr. Kelsey receiving the Distinguished Federal Civilian Service Medal from President John F. Kennedy. It's the highest order that a president can bestow upon a civilian. She had saved hundreds of thousands of lives and the prevention of deformities across the entire US. And that was a win-win for the FDA, who had been previously under pressure to be more accommodating of developments. That gave rise to the 1962, I believe it was 1962 amendments to the Food, Drug and Cosmetic Act. And there were a number of amendments established from that framework that required manufacturers for the first time ever to prove scientifically that a medication was not only safe, because we'd had that issue with the sulfanilamide, but it was safe and effective. There were no nasty, hidden, detrimental effects associated with that. We saw some subsequent changes to the Act, enforcement, because up until that point, manufacturers, if they didn't get the green light or a question from the FDA within 60 days of their submission, they could put their product straight to market. Sure. So you can imagine the amount of submissions landing with the agency, and if they couldn't respond within 60 days, that device or product was straight on the market. So that had to change. So we've come through the 1930s, 1960s, then we hit the 1970s, and we have what was part of the Pfizer organization, Shiley. In 1978, Shiley had developed the first significant artificial heart valve. And that valve was subject to clinical trial. Shiley noted a number of strut failures. So their heart valve was essentially a ring. Around that occluder ring were 3 steel prongs, retainers. So if you imagine, with every beat of the heart, blood flows, so the disc would push up to hit the retainer and then come back down as the pulse eased. So it was a one-way non-return valve. Shiley told the agency, don't worry yourself about these failures we're identifying and recognizing. These are part of development and they're anomalies. They're no big deal. FDA saw no reason to think otherwise. However, through post-market analysis, and we have to remember that the FDA's post-market analysis is way more robust than anything we've seen in Europe. But as events are reported, and they hit 1990, so this is from 1978 during development and clinical trials through release and subsequent use, as of 1990, there had been 295 reports of fractures of that strut. That occluder disc strikes those struts some 40 million times a year. Shiley, at this time, obviously were not subject to design control. But this changed the landscape because this was identifiable, this was predictable. They were seeing failures in clinical study. Today, we're required to subject our devices in design control to anticipated use conditions, representative of their intended use. And this is exactly why. We want to know that you have tested this device to its point of failure to understand where that failure occurs, and then perhaps either modify the design or put limitations on its stated purpose and intended use. If you imagine, from those 295 fractures, there were at least 178 deaths. So 178 people expired because the strut fractured and the occluder disc floated off into the heart. And at the time, there was no authority for the FDA to recall a product, to force a manufacturer to withdraw the product, and there was little in the way of traceability of a product. Well, you think of a Class 3 device now and traceability requirements. So in 1990, as a consequence of the Shiley heart valve, the Safe Medical Device Act was introduced. And this was a seismic shift for the medical device world, because the Safe Medical Device Act, in particular, Section 2, Paragraph C, it's something anyone involved in quality or development should be able to tell you. The device will not expose patients to an unreasonable or significant risk of illness or injury, and the probable benefit to health from the use of the device outweighs the risk of injury or illness from its use, taking into account the probable risks and benefits of currently available devices or alternative forms of treatment. So when we talk about benefit risk analysis in the context of 14971, and now risk management is all through the quality systems management regulation, this is not new. Risk benefit has been a deliverable since 1990. So if you don't have a documented risk benefit analysis as part of your design file, you really are in a world of trouble. That needs to be there, because that ultimately seeds your expectations of risk throughout the development of that product and the ongoing manufacturing activities and the subsequent data that you get back from the field from real experience, lived experience, to say, are we still capable of meeting this requirement? In another sort of soft touch area, but it's one you see pop up in inspections on a regular basis, and that is safety and effectiveness and stated use of the device. GlaxoSmithKline, besides being involved in the life sciences industry, were also responsible for producing a blackcurrant fruit cordial called Ribena. It's a big thing. It's a family institution in the UK for sure. Quite often people who are feeling a little under the weather, especially children, would take a drink of Ribena to make them feel a bit better. However, GlaxoSmithKline promoted the product in the image of bottles of the product as a toothbrush and made claims about its acceptability from the Dental Association, etc. There were absolutely no data available to prove its oral hygiene benefits. So GlaxoSmithKline were pinged for their marketing literature and making false claims. So there's a close relationship, a harmony between a device and its literature and its stated claims. You have to be able, through scientific data, support the performance of those claims. And that brings us to date, because as you know, Europe had to introduce the regulation, the IVDR and the MDR. That was driven by a number of unfortunate events in the European community. We all knew about the metal and metal hip implant issues and subsequent metallosis, but we also had the very highly publicized and well-known issue around breast implant, and how a French organization decided to save money, and rather than use a silicone that had been tested and confirmed as suitable from a carcinogen toxicity perspective, they instead went with a much, much cheaper industrial silicone alternative, without appreciating the damage that that would do to the enclosure mechanism. And these implants subsequently burst or leaked in women. And we have to keep in mind that the majority of women who experienced this failure and the release of carcinogens into their system were women who had undergone breast augmentation surgery as a result of having breast surgery to remove cancer. So not only did they think they had relieved themselves of their breast cancer and maintained the physical appearance of a healthy woman, they were now subject to those implants leaking carcinogenic and toxic material into their system.
You mentioned about the market monitoring opportunities, or capability, I should say, in the US and here in Europe. So why is it so much better in the US, and how can we learn from that?
That's a great question. You know, for years, for as long as I can remember, reportable events or close calls, not necessarily experiences of fatal harm, were reported in the US using MOD, or the MDR system. And that data is freely available to everyone. Anyone can log on to the database and do a quick check for this particular device. And believe me, in a litigious nation such as the United States, patients who've had a consultation with their doctor and their doctor suggesting a knee replacement, and here's the knee replacement I intend to use, that patient will go home and do a quick search for that device and its performance on the agency's website, amongst others. We as yet still can't do that in Europe. We've had Udamed created specifically as a consequence of the post-market activities relative to the implementation of the MDR, the EU MDR and IVDR. It is failing people miserably. So here we are in 2026 without the same quality of information that has been available to people in the United States since the 1990s. Hello? I mean, yeah, I'm not Brussels' friend at all, because it is bureaucracy on steroids and overpaid. And it's not good for industry when things take this long. It's not good for the industry. It's especially not good for the patient. The patient should have access to this data.
It just lets me think about it could be so much easier if we just copied working systems rather than reinventing the wheel every single time.
For an industry that has a reputation for copy and paste literally everything, why we couldn't copy and paste the system from the United States, I don't know.
You also talked about MDSAP, for instance, Medical Device Single Audit Program. How is this beneficial to medical device manufacturers, and how? I mean, I personally use it to understand regulations a bit, because it synthesizes different perspectives into one, and then you get a better understanding of what's actually required. But what can we learn from MDSAP? And
so MDSAP came about, I suppose, as a byproduct from the International Medical Device Regulators Forum. So the IMDRF was established a few years ago when they terminated the GHTF, the Global Harmonization Task Force. And that was hugely disappointing, because industry were participants in that panel. And, you know, it exposed us to the genius of some individuals, and in particular one who we both know and we've interacted with, Dr. Wayne Taylor. The man is a walking reference library to statistical analysis tools and techniques. And he co-wrote part of the guidance, industry guidance for process validation. And he has a number of tools, but also a number of books available for people to understand how to apply statistical techniques in our industry. And that was fantastic. But unfortunately, other elements of GHTF were not being coordinated and producing the output of a similar fashion. And the global regulators decided to call time and say, you know, industry, if you're not up to playing ball, we'll just take our ball and go off and create a different game. And they did. And they established the IMDRF. The IMDRF was founded by the FDA and a few others. And since then, it has grown to include other countries. And there are many nations, developing nations, which are now associate members of the IMDRF because they see the benefit of harmonizing regulatory expectations, because it creates a one market global enterprise for our industry. And we're all comparing apples with apples. Let's align our regulatory expectations, streamline the submission process. And we're seeing huge benefits to that. And that's really how the MDSAP initiative came about. Now, what we have to be acutely aware of is that our friends in Washington do not surrender their entitlement to come and inspect you just because you have a good MDSAP audit. If the MDSAP audit is less than favorable, and there, as you know, there's a ranking or rating system in the severity of the nature of observation, FDA are informed automatically. Every member of the MDSAP program where this is applicable is notified. So if you have a bad MDSAP audit for Brazil, then the agency are going to be informed. So don't be surprised if you get a letter advising you of the intention of the FDA to come and visit your facility. So in order to get the benefit of MDSAP, you need to be good at what you do. You need to be inspection ready at any time, every day, as a way of life, as a way of going about your business, not putting in a special effort because you've just received advance notice that someone's coming to visit. So MDSAP is massively beneficial in reducing the time lost and the inconsistencies and expectations across international regulators.
And how do you think it's not seen as a cheap way or easier way to get away from FDA inspections? I mean, since MDSAP is the first gate, if they manage to convince the auditor that they are doing a good job, then FDA won't be informed. So how is it not a cheap way of getting away from FDA inspections?
Oh, crikey, I wish I knew the answer to that question, because having experienced annual visits from the agency, I can tell you it put years on me. I was always confident of my organization. And in the years that I hosted FDA, I never once received a 483 observation, not one, because compliance was intuitive and intrinsic to our day-to-day activity. Why should any other standard be any way different? It really shouldn't be. If your quality management system is designed, applied, and managed in that way, it should be intuitive. You should have nothing to fear whatsoever. And if you're a lower classification device and a class 2 for a USA product, please utilize MDSAP to its full effect, because if you maintain a good profile with MDSAP, you will never see the FDA. The FDA will only show up if you have a particularly bad audit experience. If you're a class 3 device manufacturer, forget it. The FDA are going to come and visit you anyway.
With the recent shift from QSR to QMSR and the removal of QSIP, how does the inspection change? And do you think it's going to get easier, or what is the biggest difference?
No, it's not going to get easier. And talking with people who have undergone FDA inspections in the latter part of last year, they have confirmed that inspectors are being trained, and trained rigorously in relation to the new QMSR. The other thing is that they are seeking to test areas where previously they haven't gone.
Yeah, that leads me to my next question. I mean, we both know the deficiencies that manufacturers have when it comes to validation, to sample sizing, test method validation. Those are my area of expertise. But now it opens an entire gate if they have access to the suppliers through supplier audits. And from what I experienced so far, suppliers are not doing very well it's not necessarily the supplier's fault, but yeah, I think there is a huge opportunity for improvement, let's say it that way. And how is this a threat, or can it be a threat to medical device manufacturers?
It is a threat to the availability of devices and the productivity and ultimately the commercial viability of manufacturers. So FDA, as far back as the mid-noughties, were taking a strong interest in supply chain and supply chain quality, because manufacturers were having more people employed who were very proactive in the realm of offshore supply. So bringing on board, rather than components, sub-assemblies, or even entire assemblies to be finished and packaged in their own facility, or they would produce the device in number and send it to another organization to finish, pack, label, sterilize, distribute, etc. So with that, the tactics and approach of the agency changed. And we're seeing more and more, especially in the last, I would say, 5 years, perhaps, maybe a little longer, but certainly in the last 5 years, FDA found themselves telling the manufacturer that they're going to the supplier. They are not going to write up the supplier with a 483. They're not able to do that. What they are going to do is they're going to ding you with a 483 because you're not effectively managing your supply chain. And one of the key aspects that continue to crop up is a supplier's lack of adequate production and process controls, in particular process validation. And with that goes hand in hand your particular area of expertise, TMV. How can you objectively demonstrate that output from your supplier's process conforms to specification in relation to the critical aspects of that component or material? And if you either A, have an adequate TMV of your incoming inspection, boom. If your supplier is doing it for you and you're accepting items in on the basis of a certificate from your supplier, then okay, let's have a look at the TMV for the release test activities of that supplier. What's that? Boom. So yeah, the supply chain is a particular vulnerability, and the sooner manufacturers wake up to that weakness on their flank, the better protected they'll be.
So you're saying that we will see a flood of warning letters related to supply chain issues?
I would say we'll see supply chain issues, in particular as they relate to process validation and test method validation, increase, because accessibility and awareness as part of risk management, because risk management is setting the roadmap for what you verify, validate, and control, and where you choose to control it and how you control it. So yeah, if we aren't on top of our processes, those that we control directly and those that we have offshored to someone else, then we're exposed.
Having talked about the regulations that we have to follow and the experience that we both make with, or both have with manufacturers not doing so, why do you think they don't see the regulatory requirements, which are here anyway? Why don't they see it as an opportunity to grow and maybe even save money because becoming more profitable? Why? So the first question, why do you think this is? And how can, or what would you recommend them to start seeing the dollars that are behind that, and to see it actually something that helps the company's baseline or the bottom line?
I don't want to be disparaging of executive management, but bean counters get in the way of so many things. They are unable to see, and perhaps that's our fault in the quality and regulatory side of the business and the good engineering side of the business, to make the economic argument as to why controlling your process is better, being better assured of a quality transfer of a design to manufacture is better for the business economically in the long run, because the response to a warning letter is likely to take in excess of 44% of your revenue. 44% of your revenue, because you're going to have to hire in external support. You don't have the internal support because either you had them and they weren't able to do what they ought to have been doing because of focus on other things, or you need that support and you need that independent oversight. But you're also going to have additional scrutiny on your products and processes. You may incur additional waste as you revalidate processes and discover that over time, the process you have today is not the process you initially qualified, if indeed you qualified it at all. So all of that time and effort takes considerable resource. and you're diverting cash from the business to now being able to stay alive. Because let's not forget, the FDA can shut you down. It's a place of last resort, but they've done it before and they'll continue to do it. There are strong economic arguments why effective quality management system is good for business. And back in my earlier career, when I was a site director for quality and regulatory, I knew and understood my audience, and I would try and bring it back to dollars and cents as much as possible because the other people around the table actually understood that. So if I wanted to introduce a change in a process or introduce a new analytical package or a new piece of test equipment, I would always equate to that to what it was going to save us. It's not compliance. Yeah, compliance is there, and it's a necessity. It's an absolute necessity.
Yeah.
But there's good business reasons why we want to be compliant, because it's actually the most economical and effective way to go about our business. So be prepared to make that argument to your senior and executive management team. It makes sense. When I was confronted with a program edict from executive management to knock X% off the piece part price of certain components for devices, I was horrified. Not because I didn't want the organization to benefit from an additional supply of those parts. I wanted the business to understand what was going to be necessary in requalifying these parts. These parts were going to have to undergo 10993 testing again. Oh, don't worry about that because it's the same materials just coming from a different supplier. Yeah, different supplier is a design change for any number of reasons, but one in particular is their manufacturing materials and their processes may not be identical even though the raw material is. So we need to analyze these components to determine that they're not introducing a new contaminant that we were previously unaware of. So that's an additional burden. Shelf life testing, re-sterilization validation, reprocess validation. Holy moly, very suddenly, the economics of the target of that piece part reduction is swamped by the cost necessary to requalify that part just because you want to save a few cents on a part. It behoves us in this side of the house to be able to convey that cost to the management team so that they can make an informed decision. And if the business decides that on balance, everything considered, that's how they want to go, then fair enough. But we have to try and minimize the unnecessary financial burden that comes about in our industry so unbelievably easily.
We currently see a shift for a lot of automotive suppliers that want to get into the medical device industry.
Yeah.
And there's one simple thing. I mean, if they do their homework and really know how to do things like process validation, test method validation, they become so much more valuable to medical device manufacturers. And if they don't have to be developed in order to be able to survive in the industry.
Yeah. So, I mean, back in my very young days as a supplier quality engineer, I used to be so excited at the prospect of onboarding a new supplier who was involved in the automotive industry. So we in the medical device industry, we've been parasites in relation to regulation and standards. We've watched other industries, typically automotive, aviation, and fast-moving consumer goods, set the benchmark, and then we pirate it and bring it into med device. So when you think back to QS 9000, the automotive standard originally created by Chrysler, Ford, etc., they were the guys who set about part and component qualification requirements. They were the guys who set up FMEAs. They were the guys who explicitly stated process capability requirements. That QS 9000 evolved into TS 16949 and then onwards. So if you have a supplier who is very familiar with the standards expected for the automotive industry and have been at it for years successfully, you know you've a very, very good starting point for onboarding them into the medical device arena because they're set up to meet standards and they themselves see it as a profitable way to do business because they don't want unnecessary waste. And they see medical device as a safe industry. People will continue to have to need medical devices even though the technology changes. If there's a recession, car sales go down, car production needs go down, and the need for their components subsequently goes down on already tight, reduced margins. So the attraction to the medical device industry, even in small volumes by comparison, is very appetizing for that industry sector. And we see them coming more and more to the medical device industry.
I have one last topic that I want to address here. I mean, you know that I've been involved in AI tools and making regulatory and quality management processes faster and do the heavy lifting for us. What are the global trends that you see shaping right now or for the next generation in MedTech regulations? And how do you see AI is supporting this, or what role does AI play in this?
AI, and we are talking about things which are more complex and more robust than Grok or ChatGPT. We're talking about quite sophisticated machine learning initiatives, both from an actual device perspective. So we're seeing AI become quite predominant in the field where human inspection can be replaced. And by that, I mean pathology. The use of AI and pathology techniques is extraordinary. So being able to analyze in an in vitro situation or scenario, slides taken from a patient, which are then digitized and then subject to AI analysis, they're able to detect cancer earlier. They're able to determine the nature of the cancer sooner. And with that, pair the AI to a particular immunotherapy or chemotherapy regime. That is so incredibly exciting to see that come on. We're seeing it in terms of in situ analysis as well. So using AI to image on a live patient to help guide a surgeon during a surgical procedure. The reduction in risk to the patient by being able to do that is phenomenal. So AI is a huge growth area when it comes to medical devices in their own right. The use of AI in production technologies and systems to support production is unlimited. It's extraordinary. I mean, I was around to see the introduction of ERP and MRP systems, and that was groundbreaking. To witness the evolution of AI is just so exciting because the power of it is limitless. It does need to be corralled and used in constructive ways because it can be as harmful as it can be helpful. So we need to be really careful about that. But the future is so incredibly bright when it comes to the utilization of AI in our industry. And regulators and agencies are using AI. FDA have been using AI for a very long time to help them understand trends in device performance and focus on particular manufacturers that may need some attention. So the regulators are using AI as well because their resources in terms of people are not limitless. So AI is beginning to feature in so many aspects. But with that comes risk and exposure to corruption. And the other big topic, which is becoming more and more prevalent in headlines in our industry, is that of cybersecurity. Because we are susceptible to exposure if either an innocent corruption were to take place or a malicious corruption were to take place. So the challenge for our industry and the regulators going forward is going to be one of ensuring that the utilization of AI is both constructive but not unrestricted, so that we have sufficient and adequate safeguards around that as it evolves. But it's a race. It's an absolute flat-out race because the creative people in software development, when you pair them up with some fantastic medical professional talent, the boundaries are endless in terms of future development. So it's an incredibly exciting time.
You need to be brave in order to tap into an area where no one went before. Like, I mean, so many clients don't yet fully embrace AI, and there is a number of reasons why this is a very good idea. But also, I think someone needs to be brave to.
Absolutely. Courage and a spirit of adventure is essential in this industry. It's not about breaking barriers, it's about establishing new frontiers. And if you're able to exploit that in a beneficial way, you will be rewarded extremely highly for it because very few are going to be able to catch up with you very quickly. So, you know, as I said earlier about the regulation being reactionary, it's the way it's always going to be. It's reactionary because our industry has brave people who find new ways of doing things. Sometimes that comes with an inherent risk, and we have to appreciate that. But if you're one of the types who just want to sit back and go along for the ride, you're never, ever going to be the success that you had the potential to be. So being adventurous, being creative, and being respectful of who ultimately we do all this for, which is the patient. But there's a very, very bright future ahead.
Great. I'm really looking forward to what's to come. Donald,
Yeah.
if you had to summarize the overarching trajectory of MedTech regulations over the past decades, how would you describe it?
I think back to the very early medical devices and the exploratory use of anesthesia and where we've come to today. People are alive today who just 10 years ago would not have been the case. I mean, as you know, I had my own personal experience last summer when I was diagnosed with cancer. And it was a privilege not just to meet that team, but it was also an honor to be on the table surrounded by products that I've touched in my career. So it has a very personal impact on me, but I wouldn't be here today was it not for the creative skill, the foresight, the courage, the bravery, and the intellect of so many people who strive to find a better way every day to do better for people. And this industry is only on one trajectory. It's never gone backwards. It may have plateaued occasionally, but we get little catalysts that come along, and AI is the most current one. And it's going to take us to the next level of ingenuity and creativity in our industry. What a fantastic time to be involved in the industry. The speed of change in the last decade is just breathtaking. It is phenomenal. The only limit is our own ability to be creative. So I think it's just an exciting time to be in this industry, and we are blessed to be an integral part of making that happen. And that's what gets me out of bed every day, is being able to support organizations arrive at solutions. What a great way.
Absolutely. That's a positive and bright outlook for the future. I love that. And I'm really, really curious to what's to come. That was an amazing interview, way longer than I expected, but right on time for your next meeting. I want to say thank you. Thank you not only for this meeting, but thank you for becoming a very, very good mentor over the past 3 years. I've learned a ton of things from you, and I'm still learning every day. And I had the opportunity to spend 1 hour, 1.5 hours now with you and learn a ton of new things. So really, really thank you for that. And I hope we can do this again. Maybe we have a deep dive on a different topic, but that was amazing. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome, Simon. And, you know, it's a pleasure. It's always a pleasure to meet with you and chat with you, shoot the breeze, and problem solve. It's what we do. So, yeah, thanks. It's been a pleasure.
You like this video? Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. See you in the next one.